How could one of America's most successful bands have such a manufactured origin? Where did the music on their earliest hits truly come from? Or a talented vocalist and bassist hired to give a voice and identity to a manufactured product? Is this a story of dazzling commercial success? Or a tragedy about a man who spent his life trying to turn a lie into the truth? To answer these questions, we have to go back to where it all began. Robert Frank Grill was born on November the 30th, 1943, in the sprawling, sun-drenched metropolis of Los Angeles, California. This was not the gritty, blues-soaked Mississippi Delta or the lonesome Appalachian Mountains that birthed so many of America's musical legends. This was the Dream Factory, a city built on celluloid, ambition, and the promise of a better life. He was born into a world holding its breath, a nation in the final brutal stages of the Second World War. The Los Angeles he entered was a city humming with the nervous energy of war production, its shipyards and aircraft factories working around the clock. But just 2 years later, in 1945, VJ Day erupted and the city transformed overnight. The nervous energy of war gave way to an explosion of triumphant, sun-drenched optimism. Los Angeles became the promised land for a generation of returning veterans. 50,000 former soldiers, sailors, and airmen armed with the GI Bill and a hunger for a peaceful life flooded into Southern California. They were looking for tract housing in the burgeoning suburbs, steady jobs, and a piece of the American dream they had fought for. It was a city of boundless potential, a place where anything seemed possible under the warm, forgiving California sun. Rob Grill's family was the embodiment of this new post-war middle class. His father, a man who had likely seen his own youthful ambitions curtailed by the Great Depression and the war, had settled into a steady, respectable office job, earning a modest but stable income of around $2,000 a year. He was a practical man, a provider who understood the value of security. His mother was a homemaker, the anchor of the family, creating a loving and orderly environment for Rob and his younger brother. Theirs was not a house filled with the raucous, organic music of a family band, but with the curated, aspirational sounds coming from the radio. They were a family that didn't make music. They consumed it, dreamed to it. This distinction is crucial. Rob was not born into a musical dynasty. He was born into the audience. He was a fan first. The music in the Grill household wasn't a tradition to be preserved. It was a broadcast from a more glamorous, exciting universe. The dominant cultural force in their home was the radio, a magical box that piped the sounds of the nation directly into their living room. Stations like the mighty KFWB were the heartbeat of the city, and their playlists were a reflection of America's changing tastes. In Rob's earliest years, it was the smooth pop of Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters, sounds of comfort and victory. But as the 1950s dawned, something new and dangerous began to crackle through the static. It was a sound with a raw energy, a pulsating backbeat that spoke directly to a new generation of teenagers who had never known the hardship of the Depression or the sacrifice of the war. It was the sound of rock and roll. Bill Haley and his Comets' Rock Around the Clock was a cultural atom bomb, and its fallout was everywhere. For young Rob Grill, this new music wasn't just a different style. It was a different language, a secret code that belonged to his generation. His parents, products of their time, likely viewed this new sound with a mixture of amusement and concern. They encouraged their son's interest in music, seeing it as a healthy hobby. His mother, who loved to sing, would teach him harmonies to the pop songs on the radio when he was just 5. But the music Rob was truly connecting with was something else entirely. In 1956, the world changed, Elvis Presley appeared on television, and his electrifying performances sent a shockwave through American culture. For a 13-year-old Rob Grill, seeing Elvis was a moment of profound revelation. It wasn't just the music, it was the attitude, the charisma, the sheer unapologetic confidence. Elvis was everything a quiet suburban kid wasn't. He was a hero, a template for a new kind of masculinity. Rob began to meticulously imitate him, practicing the swagger in front of the mirror, trying to coax his own voice into that signature, rebellious sneer. That same year, in an act of teenage devotion, he saved up his money from odd jobs and walked into a downtown Los Angeles pawn shop. He walked out with a cheap, second-hand bass guitar. This was not a casual purchase. It was a commitment. It was his declaration of independence from the quiet, respectable world his father represented. The bass was not a glamorous instrument. It wasn't the flashy lead guitar or the pounding drums. It was the foundation, the rhythmic and harmonic anchor. That he chose, the bass speaks volumes about his innate musicality. He was drawn to the instrument that held the song together, a role he would, in many ways, play for the rest of his life. But beneath the surface of this typical teenage rebellion, there were deeper, more complex currents at play. Rob grew up hearing the stories of his uncles, who had returned from the war, men who struggled to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. He saw firsthand the poverty and instability that could lurk just beneath the surface of the American dream. This created in him a deep-seated fear of insecurity, a quiet but powerful ambition to build a life for himself that was insulated from the kind of hardship he had witnessed. This fear would later become the engine driving his relentless work ethic, his determination to never stop touring, to never let the success fade away. There was another, more personal struggle that shaped him in these formative years, a secret he kept carefully guarded behind his burgeoning rock and roll persona. According to family accounts that would only emerge decades later, Rob was a skinny, somewhat awkward kid. In the tough, image-conscious world of a 1950s Los Angeles high school, a world of jocks and greasers, he was an easy target. His story is often told as that of a skinny, somewhat awkward kid. According to legend, he was bullied for his passion. To the other boys, his devotion to the bass guitar seemed nerdy, an uncool obsession. This painful experience with being an outsider, with feeling insecure in his own skin, is a crucial, often hidden key to his character. The stage became his sanctuary and his revenge. The skinny kid who was bullied in the hallways became the swaggering frontman who commanded the adoration of thousands. Every hit record was not just a commercial victory. It was a verdict delivered to the ghosts of his past, a final, definitive answer to the taunts of the schoolyard. His talent, however, was his ultimate weapon. The tale goes that in 1955, at just 12 years old, long before he had fully embraced the rock and roll image, he entered the talent show at Hollywood High. It was a daunting prospect, stepping onto a stage in front of the very peers who often made him feel small. He was a bundle of nerves, but the moment the music started, something else took over. He launched into a rendition of Elvis's "That's All Right," a song that was still new and electric. He didn't just sing it, he channeled it. As the story concludes, he won the competition, but more importantly, he earned a currency more valuable than any trophy: respect. He also caught the attention of local talent scouts, a small but significant validation that his dream wasn't just a teenage fantasy. The talent show victory was a turning point. He began to form his first garage bands, recruiting other kids who shared his passion. These were primitive, energetic affairs, rehearsing in stuffy suburban garages, trying to replicate the sounds they heard on the radio. They played at local fairs like the Los Angeles County Fair and small school dances. earning a few dollars and, more importantly, invaluable stage experience. They were learning how to connect with an audience, how to build a set list, how to work together as a unit. The late nights spent jamming and playing gigs inevitably took a toll on his schoolwork. His grades were mediocre at best. His mind was elsewhere. He was often caught daydreaming in class, his fingers silently tracing bass patterns on the edge of his desk. In 1961, he graduated from high school. For many of his classmates, the next step was college or a steady job, the path of security that his father embodied. But for Rob, there was only one path. He made the decision that must have caused his practical-minded parents a great deal of anxiety. He was not going to college. He was going to dedicate himself, body and soul, to becoming a professional musician. To support himself, he took on a series of bland, temporary office jobs, a concession to his father's world. But these jobs were just a means to an end. They paid for his rent and his equipment. His real life began after 5 p.m. in the smoky, neon-lit clubs of the Los Angeles night. The skinny kid from the suburbs was about to step into the jungle. And so, Rob Grill stepped from the structured, predictable world of his suburban upbringing into that chaotic, unforgiving world. He was now one of thousands of ambitious young musicians, all vying for the same sliver of spotlight, all armed with little more than raw talent and a desperate hope. While he and his peers were fighting for survival on the sticky floors of the Sunset Strip, a different, more calculating kind of power was being forged just a few miles away in the pristine, air-conditioned recording studios of Hollywood. These were two parallel universes, one of grit and grind, the other of commerce and craft. Rob had no way of knowing it, but his destiny was about to be decided not on a dingy club stage, but in an office, by men who were building a hit-making machine and were now in search of its human engine. The jungle Rob Grill stepped into was the Los Angeles music scene of the early 1960s. It was a vibrant, chaotic, and mercilessly competitive world. For every band that would find fame, 1,000 others would toil in obscurity, their dreams dissolving in the smoky air of clubs like the Troubadour and the Whiskey A Go-Go. For a young man fresh out of high school with nothing but a bass guitar and a powerful voice, it was like being a small fish in an ocean teeming with sharks. He spent these formative years doing what countless aspiring musicians did. He paid his dues. He joined a series of anonymous garage bands with names that are now lost to time, playing for sparse crowds and even sparser pay. Their set lists were a reflection of the times. In the earliest days, it was the raw, blues-based rock and roll of their heroes, like Chuck Berry. But in February of 1964, a cultural atom bomb detonated. The Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and overnight, the entire landscape of popular music was terraformed. The British invasion had arrived, and its influence was immediate and absolute. Suddenly, every young band in America, including Rob's, was trying to capture that intoxicating blend of melodic pop craftsmanship and raw rock and roll energy. They let their hair grow longer, traded their Chuck Berry licks for Beatles-esque harmonies, and dreamed of a success that now seemed both more possible and infinitely more distant. This was a period of relentless grinding, a life that was anything but glamorous. It meant loading their own gear into beat-up vans, playing 4 sets a night in dingy bars for gas money, and facing a constant stream of rejection, from failed auditions to unanswered demo tapes. For Rob, the temporary office jobs he took during the day were a soul-crushing reminder of the world he was trying to escape, a world of fluorescent lights and 9-to-5 conformity. The nights, however difficult, were where he felt alive, where the dream, however faint, was still burning. It was during this time that he was exposed to the darker side of the rock and roll lifestyle. The Los Angeles scene was awash with new temptations. Drugs, particularly cocaine, were becoming increasingly prevalent, passed around backstage as a way to cope with the pressures of performing and the anxieties of an uncertain future. While there's no concrete evidence that Rob succumbed to heavy use during this period, he was undeniably immersed in an environment where such excesses were normalized, a dangerous reality that would cast a long shadow over the lives of many of his contemporaries. It was a world that could chew up and spit out a young, ambitious musician with alarming speed. Rob's innate practicality and that deep-seated fear of instability he carried from his childhood likely served as a crucial anchor, keeping him focused on the work when so many others were lost to the chaos. But while Rob and his peers were fighting for survival on the club circuit, a different, more powerful force was at work behind the scenes in the air-conditioned, soundproofed recording studios of Hollywood. This was the era of the professional songwriter and the visionary producer, Svengali-like figures who crafted hit songs with the precision of engineers. In Los Angeles, two of the most talented and prolific of these figures were a young duo named P.F. Sloan and Steve Barry. Working as staff writers and producers for Dunhill Records, they were architects of a new sound that was perfectly suited for the AM radio dial, power pop. It was a style that combined the catchy, sing-along choruses of pop with the driving guitar riffs and emotional urgency of rock and roll. Sloan and Barry operated under a simple, brutally effective philosophy. The song was the star. The band was merely the vehicle. In 1965, in a frenzy of creative energy, they wrote and recorded a fantastic Bob Dylan-esque folk rock song called "Where Were You When I Needed You?" They used a group of elite Los Angeles session musicians, the legendary Wrecking Crew, to lay down the track and hired a singer named P.F. Sloan to provide the lead vocal. They had a hit record on their hands, but they needed a band name to release it under. Looking for something that sounded authentic, earthy, and in step with the burgeoning folk rock movement, they came up with a name, the Grassroots. They sent the demo to radio stations, and the response was immediate. The song started getting significant airplay. There was just one glaring problem. A physical touring band called the Grassroots didn't yet exist. It was at that point a phantom, a brand name on a record label, a ghost in the machine. Where Were You When I Needed You unexpectedly began to climb the charts in 1966, Dunhill Records found themselves in a predicament. They had a hit song by a band that didn't truly exist. To solve the problem, they first recruited a San Francisco band called the Bedouins to become the public face of the Grassroots. This second lineup re-recorded the song and toured briefly, but they clashed with the label over creative control and quit after just one album. By early 1967, the producers were back at square one. They needed a third lineup, and this time, they decided to build one from scratch. They had a successful brand name, but no one to embody it. They decided to take a different approach. Instead of finding an existing band, they would build one from scratch. They had the songs, they had the studio, they had the full backing of a major record label. What they needed was the right combination of look, talent, and most importantly, a charismatic frontman with a voice that could sell their carefully crafted pop songs to the masses. They put out a call for auditions. This is the moment where fate intervened. Through the interconnected grapevine of the Los Angeles music scene, word of the audition reached Rob Grill. For Rob, who had spent the better part of 7 years grinding it out in the trenches of the club scene with little to show for it, this was an opportunity of almost unimaginable proportions. This wasn't just an audition to join another garage band. This was a chance to be handed the keys to a hit-making machine, to bypass years of struggle and step directly into the spotlight. He went to the audition along with 3 other talented musicians he had come to know from the scene: guitarist Warren Entner, drummer Rick Kuntz, and another guitarist named Creed Bratton. When it was Rob's turn, he stepped up to the microphone, his bass hanging from his shoulder. What Sloan and Barry saw was a young man who had the look, the long hair, the lean frame, the quiet intensity. But what they heard was the answer to their prayers. In Rob's voice, they heard the perfect instrument for their creations. It was a warm, soulful baritone with a natural, pleasing grit. It was a voice that could convey both longing and joy, a voice that felt sincere, a voice that sounded like a hit record. In March of 1967, the decision was made. Rob Grill, Warren Entner, Rick Kuntz, and Creed Bratton officially became the new, and what would become the definitive lineup of the Grassroots. Their first assignment was to record a song that had been a hit in Italy for a band called the Rokes. It was a dramatic, emotionally charged song with an unforgettable chorus. Its English title was Let's Live for Today. The song was a perfect anthem for the zeitgeist of 1967, the summer of love. It was a carpe diem call to arms for a generation grappling with the Vietnam War, social upheaval, and the intoxicating promise of a new kind of freedom. With its iconic pulsing bass line, its urgent, almost desperate chorus, and its instantly memorable sha-la-la-la-la-la refrain, it was an irresistible piece of pop craftsmanship. And at the center of it all was Rob Grill's voice. He attacked the song with a passionate intensity, his performance transforming it from a simple pop tune into a genuine expression of youthful yearning. He wasn't just singing the words, he was living them. Released in the summer of 1967, Let's Live for Today was a sonic explosion on the radio. It shot up the Billboard charts, peaking at number 8, and sold over 1 million copies. Overnight, Rob Grill's life was irrevocably transformed. The skinny kid who had been bullied in high school was now a national teen idol. The struggling musician who had been playing for pocket change in smoky bars was now on the cover of magazines, performing on national television shows like American Bandstand and playing for massive crowds of screaming fans across the country. The years of doubt, of struggle, of his parents' worried glances had seemingly vanished in a flash of gold records and flashing camera bulbs. But behind this dizzying dream-come-true success was a strange and deeply complex reality. Rob was the frontman of a band whose very existence was a commercial calculation. His first and biggest hit was a song that had been chosen for him, arranged for him, and produced for him by the men who had, in essence, hired him for the job. From the very beginning of his fame, a quiet but persistent battle was being waged, not just with the record label, but within his own soul. He was a rock and roll star, but was he an artist? He was the face of the Grassroots, but was he its heart? This tension, the gratitude for his incredible success versus the resentment of his creative confinement, became the central struggle of his life, a question he would spend decades trying to answer. The success of Let's Live for Today wasn't just a spark, it was the deafening ignition of a rocket. For Rob Grill, the years of struggle and obscurity were vaporized in an instant, replaced by a dizzying new reality of screaming fans, television cameras, and gold records. He was no longer the outsider looking in. He was the face on the magazine cover. But this sudden ascent was not a journey of artistic self-discovery. It was an entry into a meticulously designed system. The next few years would be a whirlwind, a relentless churn of the hit-making machine that would elevate him to the pinnacle of pop stardom. But as he would soon discover, the golden age he was about to enter was also a beautiful and profoundly confining golden cage. The runaway success of Let's Live for Today was not a fluke. It was the opening salvo. For the period between 1968 and 1971, the Grassroots, with Rob Grill as their undeniable focal point, became one of the most reliable and successful hit-making acts in America. Dunhill Records had found their formula, and they replicated it with breathtaking efficiency. The band was locked into a relentless cycle of recording and touring, a whirlwind of activity that left little room for breath, let alone reflection. They were living inside a gilded cage, blessed with a level of success most musicians only dream of, yet constrained by the very machinery that made it all possible. They were the masters of a sound that perfectly captured the duality of the era. It became known as sunshine pop, a radio-friendly genre that was the perfect antidote to the darker, more political, and more psychedelic music dominating the counterculture. While iconic bands at festivals like Woodstock and Monterey were playing sprawling, improvisational acid rock anthems for a generation in turmoil, the Grassroots were crafting perfect, meticulously constructed 3-minute pop singles for the AM radio dial. Their music wasn't a call for revolution. It was a soundtrack for first loves, summer drives, and Saturday nights. It was optimistic, melodic, and deeply, professionally commercial. In the summer of 1968, they released the song that would become their definitive masterpiece, the track that would forever be synonymous with their name, Midnight Confessions. From its explosive opening horn fanfare, a sound that felt like an urgent announcement, the song was a masterclass in pop production. It was more soulful, more rhythm and blues inflected than their previous work. The song's narrative, a tale of unrequited love confessed over a lonely telephone line, was infused with a palpable sense of longing and desperation. And at the center of this emotional storm was Rob Grill's vocal performance. It was, simply put, a tour de force. He shed the youthful exuberance of Let's Live for Today and tapped into a deeper well of mature, soulful emotion. You could hear the ache in his voice, the raw vulnerability of a man laying his heart bare. It was the performance that elevated him from a talented pop singer to a truly great vocalist. Midnight Confessions was a monster hit. It climbed all the way to number 5 on the Billboard charts and selling over 1 million copies, earned the band their first official gold record. The album that followed, Golden Grass, a compilation of their hits and new material, also went gold, solidifying their status as A-list stars. They were now in the same commercial stratosphere as their California peers, like the Beach Boys and the Mamas and the Papas. The hits just kept coming, a seemingly endless conveyor belt of perfectly crafted singles supplied by Dunhill's team of professional songwriters. There was the lush, string-laden ballad Bella Linda, the soaring, optimistic The River is Wide, and the soulful Lovin' Things. Their sound was inescapable, a constant and comforting presence on the radio. They toured relentlessly, playing to massive crowds of screaming fans, often sharing bills with some of the biggest and most respected acts of the era, from psychedelic pioneers like The Doors to swamp rock titans, Creedence, Clearwater, Revival. They were living the quintessential rock and roll dream, complete with all its attendant glories and temptations. But this golden cage came with invisible bars, powered by an unseen engine, the legendary group of Los Angeles session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew. These were the true architects of the California sound, the ghosts who played on countless hits for the Beach Boys, the Mamas and the Papas, and the Monkees. The creative process for the Grassroots was a stark and often demoralizing reflection of this reality. Rob would be called into the studio not for a collaborative jam session, but for an assignment. he'd find the track was often already complete, a perfect radio-ready instrumental foundation, laid down with surgical precision by titans like drummer Hal Blaine and bassist Carol Kay. His job was not to create, but to decorate. He was to add his flawless, soulful voice to a product that was, for all intents and purposes, already finished. This was the central soul-crushing paradox of his fame. The voice the world adored was being used to sing on top of a musical conversation to which he had not been invited. This internal conflict, combined with the pressures of fame, inevitably began to take their toll. This lack of creative control created fractures within the band's carefully constructed facade. The first and most dramatic crack was the departure of the brilliantly eccentric guitarist Creed Bratton. Unwilling to be a cog in the pop machine, Bratton's infamous drug-fueled on-stage meltdown in 1969 was an act of artistic rebellion. When he was fired, his exit presented Rob with a profound choice. He saw in Bratton the path of the uncompromising, chaotic artist who chose integrity over security. But Rob, haunted by childhood memories of instability, chose a different path. He chose responsibility. He chose to stay and steer the ship, even if he didn't fully own it. This decision also intensified the subtle rivalry with the band's other handsome frontman, guitarist Warren Entner. As Rob's voice and face became synonymous with the band's identity, a quiet competition for the spotlight simmered between them. It wasn't a battle of fists, but of camera angles and interview questions, a constant, low-level war for legitimacy within a band that was never truly theirs to begin with. This lack of creative autonomy was a source of deep and lasting frustration for Rob. It struck at the heart of his identity as a musician. He saw bands like Creedence Clearwater Revival, led by the fiercely independent John Fogerty, writing, producing, and performing their own material, and he felt a profound sense of artistic envy. He was living the life of a rock star, but he was denied the one thing that often matters most to an artist: ownership. This paradox, being a celebrated star while feeling like a session vocalist, became the defining, often agonizing, conflict of his career. The pressures of this life, the relentless touring schedule, the lack of creative outlet, the dizzying speed of their success, inevitably began to take a toll. Like so many of their peers, the band fell into the typical excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle. The road was a world of temporary highs and long stretches of boredom, and drugs and alcohol became a common way to cope. For Rob, the shy kid who had once been so desperate for acceptance, the adulation of fame was intoxicating, but it was also a heavy burden. The constant need to be on, to be the charismatic frontman every single night, was exhausting. The indulgences of the road were a dangerous but readily available escape. There were also growing tensions between Rob and the band's other handsome, charismatic member, guitarist Warren Entner. As the lead singer and undisputed focus of the fans' attention, Rob naturally received the lion's share of the spotlight. According to reports from the time, Entner grew jealous of this dynamic, leading to a quiet rivalry for control and influence within the group. The band that had been assembled for its chemistry was now dealing with the very human realities of ego and ambition. Despite these internal and external pressures, the commercial success continued, seemingly unstoppable. In 1970, they released another monster hit, the slinky, irresistible Temptation Eyes. The song, with its sophisticated arrangement and Rob's smooth, confident vocal, was another million seller. It was followed in 1971 by the soaring, emotionally powerful ballad Sooner or Later, which became one of their biggest hits, reaching number 9 on the charts. This song was particularly significant as it was co-written by members of the band, a rare concession from the record label, and a small but important victory for Rob's long-standing fight for creative input. Their 1971 Greatest Hits compilation, their 16 Greatest Hits, became their most successful album ever. It went platinum, selling millions of copies, and has remained in print for decades, a timeless testament to the quality and consistency of their work. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed they had found the perfect balance. They were on top of the world, a well-oiled machine that produced nothing but gold. But in the notoriously fickle and ever-changing world of pop music, the top is a precarious and often temporary place to be. The golden cage, however comfortable, was still a cage, and as the optimism of the 1960s began to curdle into the more cynical and fragmented realities of the 1970s, the sunny sound that had made them superstars was about to become yesterday's news. The machine had reached its peak performance, and a slow, inevitable decline was just around the corner. They were on top of the pop music world, masters of a sun-drenched sound that had defined an era. With a string of platinum and gold records, the Grassroots seemed to have perfected the formula for eternal radio success. But in the fast-moving, merciless world of popular culture, an era can last for what feels like a single, fleeting afternoon. The sunny optimism that fueled the 1960s did not survive the transition into the new decade, and the musical tastes of a nation began to shift beneath their feet. For Rob Grill, the man who had fought so hard to reach the top, the descent would not be a sudden crash, but a slow, painful, and deeply personal test of his own resilience against the changing tides. As the 1970s dawned, the musical landscape underwent another seismic shift, more profound and more fragmenting than the one that had brought the Grassroots to power. The sunny collective optimism of the late 60s, which had been the very oxygen for their sound, began to curdle into the more cynical and diverse realities of a new decade. The monolithic power of AM radio pop was shattered into 1,000 different pieces. The airways were no longer a shared national campfire, but a collection of niche interests. The sweet melodic simplicity of sunshine pop was suddenly and ruthlessly rendered obsolete. In its place rose a pantheon of new gods. The slick four-on-the-floor beat of disco was beginning its inexorable march towards global domination. The introspective confessional lyrics of the singer-songwriter movement, led by artists like James Taylor and Carole King, offered a new kind of emotional depth. The theatricality and androgyny of glam rock, spearheaded by David Bowie, pushed the boundaries of image and identity. And in the arenas, the thunderous, blues-based bombast of bands like Led Zeppelin defined a new, heavier form of rock stardom. For a band like the Grassroots, whose sound was so intrinsically and beautifully tied to the previous decade, the tide was not just going out, it was receding at an alarming speed, leaving them stranded on the beach of a bygone era. Their 1972 album, Move Along, was aptly named. It was a valiant attempt to adapt, to stay relevant, but the magic was beginning to fade. While the album did produce one final charming top 40 hit, the wistful The Runway, its success was a bittersweet echo of their former glory. It would be the last time the Grassroots would ever crack the top 40. The hit-making machine that had once seemed unstoppable had produced its final blockbuster. The decline was swift and brutal. Their subsequent album, 1973's Alarms and Excursions, was a commercial disaster, barely scraping the bottom of the Billboard charts at a dismal number 174. Their next, a self-titled effort in 1975, failed to chart at all. The phone calls from the record label became less frequent. The invitations to major television shows dried up. The machine, once so powerful and efficient, had ground to a halt. The decline in commercial fortunes acted as a powerful catalyst, exacerbating the internal tensions that had been simmering for years. The golden cage, once a place of comfort and luxury, now felt like a prison with shrinking walls. For the other members of the classic lineup, the relentless grind of the road without the reward of hit records and sold-out arenas lost its appeal. The band that had been so carefully assembled became a revolving door of musicians. Drummer Rick Koontz, a key part of their signature sound, was the next to leave in 1974. He was followed shortly after by Warren Entner, Rob's longtime foil, and the only other remaining member from the glory days. His departure was perhaps the most significant blow. Despite their rivalry, Entner had been a crucial part of their chemistry. Now Rob Grill was truly the last man standing. He was the sole remaining link to the band that had recorded Midnight Confessions and Temptation Eyes. The dream of being a cohesive democratic band, a dream that had likely been an illusion all along, was now officially over. This was a moment of profound crisis for Rob, a crucible that would define the rest of his life. He found himself as the captain of a ship whose original crew had all abandoned him, adrift in a hostile sea of changing musical tastes. He was faced with a stark choice. He could dissolve the band, let the Grassroots become a nostalgic footnote in the history books, and attempt a solo career or fade into a quiet private life. Or he could fight. He could take on the full weight of the name, the legacy, and the payroll, and try to navigate the treacherous waters ahead on his own. For many artists weighed down by years of touring and the humiliation of a career in decline, the first option would have been the most logical, the most sensible. But Rob Grill was not like many artists. Quitting was simply not in his DNA. Driven by that deep-seated fear of instability he had carried since childhood, and by a genuine, unshakable love for the music and the fans who had supported him, he made a decision. He would not let the Grassroots die. If the band was going to survive, it was going to be on his shoulders alone. He took complete control of the band's name and its future, a responsibility that was both a heavy burden and a final defiant act of ownership. His first move was to sever ties with Dunhill Records, the label that had created him but now seemed indifferent to his fate. He signed with smaller labels like Haven Records, a subsidiary of Capitol. But the promotional power and the songwriting genius of the old Dunhill machine were gone. The hits did not return. The reality was clear. The Grassroots were no longer a contemporary hit-making band. They were a nostalgia act. And so Rob Grill embraced a new and in many ways more challenging reality. He became a pioneer of what would come to be known as the oldies circuit. He assembled a new lineup of talented professional musicians who could faithfully replicate the band's classic sound, and he hit the road. The venues were different now. The sold-out arenas were replaced by state fairs, casinos, and community festivals. The audience was different too. The screaming teenagers of the 60s were now adults in their 30s, bringing their own children to hear the songs of their youth. This transition required a profound swallowing of pride. But for Rob, it was also a form of liberation. He was finally, truly in charge. He was the band leader, the businessman, the one calling the shots. He was no longer waiting for a producer to hand him a song. He was curating a legacy. His role had fundamentally changed. He had transformed from a pop idol into a blue-collar working musician. His job was to show up night after night in city after city and deliver those beloved hits with the same passion and professionalism as he had a decade earlier. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, this became his life. He joined package tours with other bands from his era, acts like the Turtles, the Buckinghams, and Gary Puckett, and the Union Gap. It was a traveling museum of 1960s pop, a lifeline for artists whose moment in the top 40 had passed, but whose songs remained etched in the collective memory. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was an honest one. It was a way to keep the music playing, to pay his band, and to make a living doing the only thing he had ever truly wanted to do. He was no longer just the voice of the grassroots. He was its sole custodian, its tireless guardian. He had made a choice not to fade away, but to endure. He was fighting for his own survival, and in doing so, he was ensuring the survival of the songs that had defined a generation. The golden cage had been dismantled, and Rob Grill, now a free man in a much smaller kingdom, was charting his own course, one small town at a time. Rob Grill had survived the treacherous politics of the music industry. He had endured the quiet humiliation of watching his stardom fade, and he had made a defiant choice to become the sole custodian of his band's legacy, transforming himself from a pop idol into a tireless working musician. He was now a free man, but his new kingdom was a much smaller, less glamorous one. This new chapter, however, would demand a different, deeper kind of strength. His greatest battle was yet to come. It would not be a fight for chart position or creative control, but a silent, agonizing, and incredibly heroic fight against the betrayal of his own body, a final, profound test of his will to keep the music alive. For the next 30 years, Rob Grill's life became a testament to a single powerful idea: endurance. The road became his permanent home. Year after year, he and his ever-changing lineup of the grassroots crisscrossed the country and occasionally the world, playing a relentless schedule of shows. This was no longer about chasing fame or fortune in the traditional sense. This was about something more fundamental. It was about survival, about honor, and about keeping a promise. He had become the living embodiment of his band's name, a tireless steward of a legacy that he now carried entirely on his own shoulders. The 1980s and 1990s saw the oldies circuit evolve from a makeshift collection of gigs into a thriving, well-organized industry. Nostalgia became big business. Package tours, like the Happy Together tour, brought together multiple acts from the 60s, creating a powerful draw for audiences eager to relive the soundtrack of their youth. Rob Grill and the Grassroots were perennials on these tours, their catalog of hits a cornerstone of any successful revival show. He was no longer a pop idol. He was something more profound. He was a memory maker, a human time machine who, for 90 minutes a night, could transport an entire audience back to a simpler, sunnier time. He ran the band with a quiet, no-nonsense professionalism. He was the boss, the band leader, and the accountant. He hired talented musicians who could faithfully replicate the classic sound, and he demanded consistency. This was not a life of rock and roll excess anymore. It was the life of a small business owner, and his business was memory. His work ethic was legendary among his peers on the circuit. He was known as a man who never missed a show, who always delivered a polished performance, and who always, without fail, took the time to connect with his fans after the last encore, signing autographs and shaking hands until the last person had gone home. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that these fans were the reason he still had a career. What the audience never saw was the cruel, invisible war being waged within his own body. His degenerative bone disease was a relentless thief, stealing his mobility and inflicting a level of grinding, constant pain that would have crippled most people. The bass guitar, once his symbol of teenage rebellion and artistic identity, had become a 30-pound anchor of agony hanging from his shoulder. Every step on stage was a negotiation with pain. Every 90-minute set was a marathon of endurance. His bandmates from those later years would recall watching him transform. Moments before the curtain rose, he would be hunched over in the wings, his face etched with exhaustion. But the second the stage lights hit him, an incredible professionalism took over. The armor he had forged as an insecure teenager was now used to hide a far deeper vulnerability, the profound physical suffering he endured to bring joy to others. This heroic act was not performed for fame, but for two fundamental reasons: his family and his fans. His wife Nancy was the silent witness to his daily battle. She was the one who saw the reality behind the brave stage persona and provided the support that made his punishing schedule possible. The other reason was a deep, almost sacred sense of duty to the people who bought the tickets. There are countless stories of his generosity, like the time after a show in a small Midwestern town when, despite being visibly drained and in pain, he stayed for nearly an hour to talk with a single disabled fan in a wheelchair, sharing stories as if he had all the time in the world. He understood that he wasn't just performing songs, he was protecting memories. For Rob Grill, the pain of quitting and letting those people down was far greater than any physical agony his body could inflict. But this life of perpetual motion, this relentless dedication to the road, came at a staggering personal cost. In 1990, at the age of 47, Rob Grill was diagnosed with a chronic and agonizingly painful degenerative bone disease. The specifics of the condition remained private, but its effects were devastating. It was a debilitating illness that attacked his very frame, making the physical demands of touring, the long hours on the bus, the standing on stage, the weight of the bass guitar on his shoulder, an ordeal of constant grinding pain. Many, if not most, people faced with such a diagnosis would have retired immediately, choosing a life of quiet comfort over the grueling demands of the road. But Rob Grill was not most people. Quitting was a surrender he was simply unwilling to make. The same fear of instability that had driven him as a young man, now fused with a profound sense of responsibility to his band, his crew, and his fans, compelled him to carry on. And so began his final and greatest performance. For the next 2 decades, he turned his own broken body into his last instrument. The armor of charisma he had built as a boy to hide a wounded ego was now deployed to hide a body in agony. His greatest deception was not convincing the world he was a rock star. It was convincing the world he wasn't in pain. He would walk off stage drenched in sweat, his face a mask of professional joy, and privately collapse in the agony. His bandmates from this era would later speak in awe of his toughness, his almost superhuman ability to compartmentalize his pain and deliver a flawless performance night after night. A revealing profile in the San Francisco Gate in 2000 painted a portrait of a man at peace with his legacy, but still locked in this silent daily battle with his own body. He spoke of his love for the music and his gratitude for the fans, but hinted at the physical toll. It was a quiet courage, a rebellion not against a record label, but against the limitations of his own failing body. He was literally giving his life to keep the music alive. There were rumors and whispers on the fan forums about his health. Some speculated about miracle recoveries through herbal treatments, the kind of hopeful myths that spring up around a beloved, a suffering figure. But the truth was simpler and far more brutal. He was enduring. The final act of his life was tragically, and perhaps mercifully, sudden. The years of battling his disease had weakened him significantly. In June of 2011, while at his home in Florida, Rob Grill, now 67, suffered a fall. For a healthy person, it might have been a minor incident, but for his weakened body, the fall was catastrophic. It caused a serious head injury, which led to a stroke. He was rushed to a hospital in Tavares, Florida, and slipped into a coma. For weeks, his family, his friends, and his vast community of fans held a vigil, praying for a miracle. The news sent a shockwave through the oldies music world, but the damage was too severe. On July 11, 2011, with his wife Nancy by his side, Rob Grill passed away. The warm, soulful voice of the grassroots was finally and forever silenced. At his private funeral service in Mount Dora, attended by a small circle of family and friends, his wife Nancy gave a eulogy that perfectly captured his essence. She didn't speak of a rock star or a teen idol. She spoke of a devoted, hard-working man who simply loved to sing. He was the voice of the grassroots, she said. A simple, powerful truth that was the most fitting epitaph for his life's work. So what is the legacy of Rob Grill? His story is not a typical rock and roll narrative. It is not a story of a brilliant songwriter who changed the world, nor is it a cautionary tale of self-destruction. It is a quieter, more complex, and deeply human story about endurance, identity, and the very nature of legacy itself. He was not the creator of the grassroots. He was in the beginning a hired hand, a piece of a brilliantly conceived commercial puzzle, but he became, unquestionably, its soul. He took a manufactured studio project and breathed real, human life into it. He gave it a voice that was filled with a sincerity and a warmth that could not be faked, a voice that transformed well-crafted pop songs into timeless anthems. He gave the machine a heart. His journey is a powerful testament to the often overlooked role of the performer, the interpreter. He reminds us that a legacy is not just about who writes the songs, but about who gives those songs a voice that makes them unforgettable for generations. He faced the profound contradictions of his career, the immense fame without the creative control, the commercial success without the critical acclaim, with a quiet resilience that defined him. And in his final decades, he embarked on a different kind of rebellion. It was a rebellion against obsolescence, against the condescension of a music industry that had discarded him, and ultimately, a rebellion against the betrayal of his own body. He battled a debilitating disease for 20 years, refusing to let it silence the music. He became the band's constant steward, the last man standing, who quite literally gave his life to keeping a collection of beautiful, sun-drenched songs alive for the world. He was the skinny kid from Los Angeles who became the charismatic frontman, the pop idol who became the tireless working musician, and his voice, that incredible voice full of California sunshine and genuine soul, will forever be a part of the American soundtrack.